Hello, this is Dr. Scott Catino, and I'm providing these video lectures for Henley Putnam students. And whether you're in the security program, the doctoral studies program, or you're in an area looking at counterterrorism or terrorism or intelligence, I think you're going to find this subject on the nature of the Soviet threat to be very practical and very useful, something you can apply directly to your studies and your service. It's easy to overlook this topic. It's easy to shelve this away and look at this as just being outdated history with little application, but really the opposite is true. So what then is the objective of this presentation? Really, there are 4 points we should try to aim at the beginning here. To develop a basic understanding of the multidimensional threat posed by the Soviet Union. The key here is to look at the broad scope of not only threats, but tools that the Soviet Union used to undermine and erode U.S. security. So looking at the very broad picture, I think we're going to come away with an understanding of some very powerful tools that the Soviet Union were able to use to attack U.S. security. By understanding a broad picture, I think we're going to get a lot out of this lecture if we do that and that alone. But we should also look at this as a contextual issue for our current intelligence, security, and strategic studies, and see this as something that has influenced not only the near period of the 1990s, but well into the present. The Soviet Union certainly served as a model with its tactical and strategic sophistication, a model copied by nations, and I should say non-state actors today. So it provides that. And the third thing is to identify these broad and potent instruments of power used by the Soviet Union that were used to undermine U.S. security during the Cold War era. By focusing in on these instruments of power, I think we're going to be able to understand weapons that are very potent and that are being used today. And fourth is to apply these as lessons learned from the era to the present as we look at the strategic plans, policies, and practices of state and non-state actors who currently threaten U.S. security and interests. The key here is application. The main points. The nature of the threat. The nature of the Soviet threat to the United States, West, and developing nations and regions of the globe was indeed multidimensional. It moved and operated across the DIME acronym, and that acronym, if you're not aware of, stands for diplomacy, intelligence or information, military, and economics. It really was that multidimensional. It was existential also, in that the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons and the very existence of the United States was threatened. And it's not just a matter of what they had and how they were, rather how broad it was, but rather in how they used it. Timing and phasing at the strategic and operational level was done very, very cleverly and very asymmetrically. And I would ask that students keep their eyes on these subjects as we move through this presentation. And unfortunately, this very topic of the Cold War has been politicized as historians battle over the subject and have not looked specifically at these tactics that are so relevant for today. So much of the scholarship today, in my opinion, is focused on trying to justify either the political right or the political left. And what's the result of that is we lose sight of so many of these important lessons learned. So let's study this from a position of wanting to understand the security value of it, rather than what side was right or wrong in the United States, what political party or what political faction was able to form a more accurate assessment of the Soviet Union. Putting that aside and looking at the measures and tactics that were used and its application to strategic studies, I think we're going to get far more out of this. It was an extraordinary time when World War II ended and the Soviet Union emerged so rapidly onto the world stage as a threat. It was quite a shock to American leaders, and it really caught many of our policymakers off guard, even though we had accurate intelligence reports indicating that the Soviets were moving in a global manner, energizing communist movements which existed and were being expanded. And we see this kind of feeling, this sense of urgency by Winston Churchill in his famous The Sinews of Peace, where he underscores this massive expansion, both geographically and an actual power of the Soviet Union and its influence with varying degrees of control. And he notes here increasing measures of control, particularly in key strategic areas such as Europe, but certainly not limited to uh, that specific locality. And he was very careful here to bring out several important points, such as the use of communist groups, raising them to preeminence as a key tool, and then the issue of totalitarian control. But I think historically we need to just take a step back for a second and see how communism at this point, Soviet communism, emerges. Communism in the 19th century was really a radical and competing ideology among other radical ideologies. In the 19th century, communism, Marxist communism, certainly wasn't the only radical ideology. In fact, anarchism was certainly, and syndicalism and other radical socialist ideologies were competitors in that they were vying for dominance of the emerging radical networks that were taking place throughout Europe and in the Western world, and were actually expanding even in that time period globally. But it wasn't until 1917 that we see this ideology of Marx becoming no longer just a following among political philosophers and radicals, but was actually elevated to a state level. Communism becomes a state, and with all the resources, the power, the energy, the technology, the sophistication, the finances, it became far more of a threat. And after World War II, with the elimination of the chief enemy of communism, which was certainly not Western liberalism or American democratic values or Western European democratic values, the fascists were the chief enemy of the communists, the Soviet communists, and with that largely eliminated, the Soviet Union is able to emerge as a global power, a global communist power. And we find that as I mentioned, our political leaders being very surprised at this, at the power and the influence of the Soviets, and then faced with the security dilemma. First of all, the Soviet Union and communism was a conventional military threat. As World War II ended, our policymakers and intelligence analysts and collectors noted rather clearly that the very large size of the Soviet conventional forces postured toward the West, and with its leaders like Joseph Stalin boasting, and once again the issue of rhetoric and speech being a key indicator, of taking Europe, our policymakers rightly ascertained that the Soviet Union and thus Soviet communism was a major conventional threat. And throughout the Cold War, so much of our strategy was based on analyzing, and our intelligence on collecting and acquiring information on Soviet conventional military capabilities, not just the large size and how it was postured aggressively, offensively toward these key strategic areas globally, um, but also the types of military capabilities they had, the type of integration, the type of leadership, the type of technical support they had, the type of logistics, etc. So the idea of the very capabilities, how it was postured, how it was led, the very quality of it, and of course rhetoric were all a major aspect that led our analysts and leaders to rightly ascertain that the Soviet Union was a conventional military threat. And that subject is a study all by itself because it becomes far more complex than that, but it's enough to say for this presentation, a conventional military threat was certainly a major aspect of the Cold War era and the threat that the Soviet Union posed. Secondly, and as importantly, even where the Soviet Union did not have a strong military presence, it was able to exert its influence to become a threat to the United States through these so-called proxy groups and proxy wars. The Soviets had supported these communist groups as proxies that they were able to use and support against Western interests and particularly American interests. And there's quite a bit of debate on this, on the degree of how much Soviet control was exercised, let's say, over the Vietnamese communists. The point really is irrelevant. The Soviets were masters of developing that relationship and were able to sometimes have direct control and sometimes have more of a partnered alliance, and other times it ranged in between there from outright direct control to more of an associate or partner. These strength and actual control really wasn't critical, but the effects and the use of the group certainly was. And these communist so-called wars of national liberation and subversive activities occurred throughout Europe to varying degrees, as I note, and throughout East Asia, and Africa, and Latin America, and posed a major threat to Western interests. As communist, as countries became communist, they would immediately deny the resources and area access to the United States that was so critical for raw materials and through economic trade. But more importantly than that, they would continue communist revolutions and spread it further and orient that area and assets to spread communism, as I noted, and to threaten U.S. interests. Thus, we see that China does not just become communist in 1949, it then becomes a major exporter of communism all over East Asia, threatening U.S. allies and certainly a threat to life and security. And strategically, the notion was to create an environment where the resources of the United States would be denied and our resources used to fight these revolutions would be depleted. And both at the strategic and tactical level, we find that attrition was a major part of these proxy wars. The idea the Soviet Union had was to wear out the United States and to wear out our economy and our forces and our political will. And thus these proxy wars were a major aspect of the entire Cold War era. Contrary to popular notions, the Cold War often turned hot. Thus the United States found itself fighting wars in Korea and Vietnam and many other places, Latin America and in Africa. It's critical to note that even where there wasn't a conventional military threat, and even where there wasn't a proxy war going on, or let's just say in the case of the Huks in the Philippines were defeated by United States allies in the Philippines, particularly the government of Ramon Magsaysay. Even when victories were achieved or security was achieved, there was always the constant threat globally of subversion, infiltration, and penetration of Western government and society. This was critical. The Soviets were masters of this and did this so well. And our security and our intelligence were very, very critical issues to deal with and to ascertain the nature of this. And first of all, I think if we just look at the successes of the Soviet Union, I mean, able to penetrate the highest level of Adolf Hitler's military establishment, his Wehrmacht. The UK, their security service, the MI6, Kim Philby was a communist agent, and even the U.S. nuclear development community, the so-called Manhattan Project, were all victims of communist infiltration and subversion. And as a result of that, the Soviets were able to gain not only strong influence, but the information that became critical to U.S. security. And it's not just an issue that simply went away or collapsed with the end of the Cold War. It's an issue that obviously affected the United States well after the Cold War had ended. And I give two examples here of Aldrich Ames and Robert Hanssen. It is very difficult to overstate or overestimate the amount of damage that these two leaders, Ames of the CIA and Hanssen of the FBI, respectively, were able to do to U.S. security. It's estimated that Ames alone compromised 100 missions and was responsible for the death of at least 10 very high-ranking U.S. sources and assets, I should say. It was the cost to U.S. security was staggering and could have been far worse had these men have not been arrested. The fact that the Soviets were able to penetrate this deeply into Western society and the Russians maintain this capability to this very day says quite a bit of their capabilities. Denial and deception at the strategic and tactical level were certainly major aspects of the Soviet threat during the Cold War. I note here in this slide, contrary to popular myth, communism not only challenged the flaws of global and Western capitalism, imperialism, and economic liberalism. They were masters at doing that, showing the weaknesses of our system, but they did so using denial and deception. They were able to, first and foremost, form their groups under the pretense of being freedom movements, nationalist movements, particularly movements of human rights and reform. And they were able to do that and create a popular front. And having done that and gained control over populations, the parties began to increasingly use force and political murder to achieve totalitarian control. So as a result of that, we find that the Soviet strategy and communism internationally was able to move across these military, political, and diplomatic levels, pushing an agenda that ultimately resulted in major population catastrophes and genocide. It was a very, very difficult situation for the United States to deal with. I'd like to call attention to this slide on this very subject, and I think if I get a little more concrete with that last point, it'll certainly make sense. I think it's wrong to look at security issues or these intelligence matters simply in a framework where we depict the Soviet Union as being in control. They certainly weren't in complete control, and there were secondary and third order effects that were created by the Soviet communist push globally. And these third order effects became terrible security challenges for the United States and certainly its allies regionally. And I think if we look at the ideological dimension of what happened with communism, we find an example in the Khmer Rouge. The very nature of communism stressing this radical ideology of the absolute necessity of purging major parts of the population. That's just a word for killing, for mass political murder taking place, with the notion of recreating society. Ideologically, that's what made communism radical. It differed historically from violent societies of the past, even ancient societies. Ancient societies could be very violent in that when they captured an area, they certainly would massacre armies or depopulate an area, but the key objective of ancient armies was to achieve control of land and resources. Communism differed from that. Its chief objective was not just the conquest of area and resources, but to control the minds of the population. And so unlike other conquerors of the past, when the communists would take over an area, they would seek to recreate society and control minds. And as a result of this, population and aspects of populations, whether they were ethnics or they were certain classes or people with loyalty to the regime, or eventually at its last stage, people that did not hold an ideological agreement with communism, would be eliminated in large numbers. So as a result of this ideology, we find a growing strain of communism becoming more radical. We see the radicalism of Lenin becoming more radical in Stalin, and even more radical than that we find it in Mao. And ultimately, in the case here, we find the Khmer Rouge, which during its time period of the 1970s when it took power, 1975, and declared year zero, we see the highest level of communist genocide, world genocide taking place, where literally 1/4 of the 8 million population of Cambodia is murdered in mass exterminations, the so-called killing fields. So the third order effects of communism, these mass genocides taking place regionally, and that against our allies, and communism spreading along this line, was certainly a major threat. Diplomatically and political, as the communist movement became more powerful, we find entire movements of countries trying to appease it and trying to work with it. This certainly wasn't the objective of the communists to have just associates. They wanted outright partners, but the mere fact that its global presence became so strong, and groups like the non-aligned movement, countries like India and others, and Indonesia, African countries, forming alliances that were claiming not to be either aligned with the United States or with the Soviet Union, but still indeed used or legitimized Soviet power, became an additional problem for us. And the United States often found itself competing with the Soviet Union for place and interest within these countries, and it became a difficult competition, fraught with high risk. I think another aspect of it is the success of Soviet communism and its very sophisticated tactics in guerrilla warfare and political tactics became an example to other revolutionary and guerrilla war groups that certainly were not communist in their orientation, but in the case we find in the Iranian Revolution, an Islamic revolution taking place, yet it relied on communist tactics. Particularly the Israeli scholars who study the Iranian Revolution, in my opinion, rightly assert that Khomeini, as he rose to power and when he seized power, really did little more than use communist organizational, political, and diplomatic tactics to seize control of Iran. And I think they're right in that assessment, and we don't have the time here to go into the details of that. But the very use of popular front groups and the very ideology and the use of purges later on were certainly a part of what Khomeini did, and these were just mimicked from communist-style political military tactics and strategies, and certainly something that Khomeini learned while he was in France and studied Marxism, Leninism. So the third order effects were something that affected U.S. security and were certainly not intended for, but the global push of the Soviet Union created this scenario. Economic warfare is something to understand. It was stated both by the United States and by the Soviet Union that economics were critical to the Cold War going on, and it was critical to the Soviet Union in particular to deny resources, to control resources, or to deplete them in such a manner that was strategically for the advantage of the Soviet Union. And thus we find our intelligence assets being very clear to point this out, as well as during the time period we find in Soviet strategic documents a term that comes up often, and that is the term balance of power. The Soviets were masters at looking at economic warfare, political warfare, and seeing how it affected the overall balance of power. And economic warfare and resources were critical to it. And even pictured here in the Gorbachev era, the very late 1980s until the collapse of the Soviet Union, it began to collapse in parts. We see Eastern Europe gaining its freedom in '89, and by '91 there's no longer a Soviet Union. But even in Gorbachev's era, this period of glasnost and perestroika, we find that the Soviet Union was very concerned with control and access to resource and resource denial, major aspects of the Soviet threat. Nuclear warfare was a major threat to the United States, and the Soviet Union repeatedly sought a strategic advantage in nuclear weapons, first strike capabilities, and given the record of aggression and genocide against their own citizens and neighboring states that had taken place, this threat was very credible. It's not enough to say that this was just rhetoric or this was just bluff. Our policymakers were very correct in looking at Soviet nuclear capabilities and being very careful to make sure the Soviets did not gain a strategic advantage. And what greater example do we have of this than in 1962 when we find the Cuban Missile Crisis taking place? This was a very aggressive act of the Soviet Union to place missiles in Cuba to gain a strategic and diplomatic advantage and leverage against the United States. And they were unsuccessful in being able to deploy the missiles there and to keep them and base them there, but they were able to gain a diplomatic advantage from it. And again, that's a subject all by itself, but we see the threat very broad now, also in the nuclear realm. Support of international terrorism, and this issue is overlooked, but was a major part of the Soviet strategy during the era, during the Cold War era. The Soviet Union trained, financed, supported logistically, supported with intelligence, and gave diplomatic cover and support to many terrorist organizations. And the list here, the groups that I have on this slide, really do not do justice to the overall effect and potency of this area of the Soviet threat. You look particularly at the one group here, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. Arafat was a major player during the time period and was undoubtedly Soviet supported. And it's particular to note that his influence was quite potent, particularly in the fact that he was postured against Israel, a major ally of the United States and the only democracy in the Middle East. So the fact that he was postured in such an aggressive manner and that his chief objective was the destruction of Israel, if that were achieved, the obvious outcome to the United States' interest in the entire Middle East would be affected by this. So it's not enough just to say, well, some of these groups are small, they might be diffuse, they're located in various areas, they're undoubtedly trained by the Soviets, they carry out terrorist activities. It was far more than that. Uh, these groups were often coordinated and used in timing during other political, military, subversive activities. We find particularly in 1968, for instance, a major push by agitators, Soviet-trained agitators across the West, causing riots and major disturbances in countries, and often these terrorist groups emerged and would add to that. This was a major threat to the United States and to U.S. allies, and in conjunction with the other threats, was certainly very potent. So in conclusion, the Soviet threat to Western security and interest during the Cold War was far more than an interesting and debatable period or epoch in modern history. The Soviet threat was the most serious security dilemma that the United States had ever faced, and one that it could have turned out very, very differently. The outcomes could have been very different. And I think we take that for granted. It truly was a battle that had to be fought. It was very fragile. I think President Nixon was correct when he said that the American economy is so strong it would take a genius to wreck it. It just was that strong. But he said, in contrast, foreign policy is so fragile that any singular wrong move could cause great damage and potentially war. And given the volatility of the era, so much of that volatility was created by the Soviet Union, and there was much to be lost. The strategy, the tactics, and operations of the Kremlin during the Cold War demonstrated a multidimensional approach, using combinations of hard and soft power, a diversity of material and spiritual, as they called it, assets, um, used synergistically, I should say, and juxtaposed, using war and subversion to dominate resources, manpower, leaders, and land area in order to deny, degrade, and ultimately defeat the United States and its Western allies. And they executed it so patiently and so carefully, it was truly a major threat. The fact that this major effort that spanned decades failed should not deter serious students from studying and understanding the strategies, tactics, and operations that define modern warfare in the era. I have my contact information here, but I would urge students who have questions on this to particularly contact their instructor at Henley Putnam that's teaching the particular course. And obviously, if you have any questions that you want to ask me directly on this presentation, I would be happy to answer them. And I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this and to watch this video lecture. And I hope you continue to do well in your studies. Thank you very much.